The man in the gray jacket wasn't watching Prince Louis like the other families. His hands were hidden. His eyes kept scanning security positions. And when the young prince walked closer to the crowd, Sergeant James Whitmore saw something that made his blood run cold. The stranger's hand moved inside his jacket. In that split second, James had to make a choice that would either save a life or end his career. What happened next at Windsor Castle? That morning would shock the entire nation and expose a conspiracy that went deeper than anyone imagined. The summer sun hung bright over Windsor Castle on a Tuesday morning in June. Families gathered along the barriers, cameras ready, hoping for a glimpse of the royal family. Children waved small Union Jack flags while their parents checked their phones for updates about the scheduled appearance. The atmosphere was festive, filled with the excited chatter of tourists and well-wishers who had traveled from across the country and around the world. Among the crowd, a man in his early 40s stood near the front barrier. He wore dark sunglasses. Despite the partly cloudy weather, a gray jacket that seemed too heavy for the warm day kept his hands buried in his pockets. His posture was rigid, and unlike the families around him who chatted and laughed, he remained silent. His eyes, hidden behind the dark lenses, were fixed on the castle entrance, with an intensity that seemed out of place among the cheerful gathering. Behind the security perimeter, Sergeant James Whitmore of the Royalty Protection Command stood at his designated post. At 36 years old, James had spent 12 years protecting members of the royal family. He had undergone extensive training in threat assessment, close protection tactics, and emergency response. His record was impeccable, his attention to detail legendary among his colleagues. Today, he was part of the security detail for a public appearance by several members of the royal family, including young Prince Louis. James scanned the crowd with practiced eyes. Years of experience had taught him to read body language, to spot anomalies in crowds, to trust his instincts when something felt wrong. He noted the families with children, the elderly couples, the tourists with expensive cameras. His gaze swept methodically across faces, looking for anything unusual. That was when he noticed the man in the gray jacket. Something about the man immediately caught James's attention. While everyone around him faced the castle entrance where the royal family would appear, this man kept shifting his position. His head turned at odd angles, as though he was studying the security layout rather than waiting to see the royals. James had seen this behavior before during training exercises designed to identify potential threats. The man was conducting surveillance. James keyed his radio discreetly and reported his observation to the command post. A voice crackled back, acknowledging the information. Other security personnel would now be watching the same individual, but James did not take his eyes off the man. Experience had taught him that threats could escalate quickly. Vigilance was the difference between prevention and catastrophe. The man in the gray jacket pulled out his phone and appeared to be texting. James noted the movement of his thumbs, the way he occasionally glanced up at the castle, then back at his screen. Was he communicating with someone? Coordinating with others in the crowd? James's training had covered various threat scenarios, including coordinated attacks involving multiple individuals. He subtly shifted his position to get a better viewing angle while maintaining his post. Around 10:15, an announcement was made that the royal family would be appearing shortly. The crowd pressed closer to the barriers, excited energy rippling through the gathering. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders. Cameras were raised. The festive atmosphere intensified. But James noticed that the man in the gray jacket did not share this excitement. Instead, he seemed to grow more tense, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping his phone tightly. James reported this change in behavior over his radio. The response was immediate. Additional plainclothes officers began moving through the crowd, positioning themselves near the suspicious individual without making their presence obvious. The security team was preparing for multiple scenarios, maintaining readiness while hoping the situation was merely an overabundance of caution. In protection work, false alarms were preferable to missed threats. At 10:27, the doors of the castle opened. Members of the royal family emerged into the sunlight, smiling and waving to the assembled crowd. The reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. Cheers erupted, flags waved vigorously, and cameras clicked in rapid succession. Among the royals was Prince Louis, walking between his parents, occasionally waving at the crowd with the unself-conscious joy of childhood. James divided his attention between the royal family and the suspicious man. Professional training allowed him to maintain awareness of both simultaneously. He saw the royals begin their planned walkabout, moving toward the barriers to greet well-wishers. He also saw the man in the gray jacket suddenly become very still, his attention locked on the approaching group. The man's right hand moved inside his jacket. Every alarm in James's trained mind went off simultaneously. A hand moving inside a jacket was a classic pre-attack indicator. In the split second that followed, James processed multiple factors: the man's positioning, his suspicious behavior, his evident tension, and now this movement toward what could be a concealed weapon. James made his decision and moved. He crossed the distance between his post and the barrier in seconds. His movement swift but controlled. Other security personnel noticed his rapid approach and began converging on the same location. The crowd, still focused on the royal family, did not immediately notice the security response developing. James reached the barrier just as the man's hand emerged from his jacket, holding something dark and rectangular. James vaulted the barrier with practiced efficiency, landing beside the startled man. In one fluid motion born from countless hours of training, he grabbed the man's wrist, controlling the hand that held the unknown object. Other officers arrived, within seconds, surrounding the man and creating a protective barrier between him and the royal family. The crowd nearby gasped and stepped back. Suddenly aware that something serious was happening, the man struggled. Trying to pull his hand free, his face contorted with effort and what might have been anger or fear. James maintained his grip, using techniques designed to control without causing unnecessary harm. More security personnel arrived, and together they carefully extracted the object from the man's hand. It was a phone, but James noted it was positioned as though the man had been preparing to point or throw it. The royal family was immediately moved back toward the castle by their close protection officers. The planned walkabout was abruptly curtailed, the family disappearing behind secured doors within seconds. The well-practiced emergency protocols activated smoothly, prioritizing safety over public relations. The crowd watched in confused silence. As the festive morning suddenly transformed into a security incident, James and his fellow officers moved the man away from the crowd, guiding him toward a secure area where he could be properly questioned. The man was shouting now, his words difficult to understand through his obvious agitation. He claimed he had done nothing wrong, that he was simply trying to take a photograph. But his behavior, his positioning, his suspicious actions warranted a thorough investigation. As they moved through the castle grounds, James noticed something that made his pulse quicken. The man's jacket pocket was bulging with something more than just a phone. James alerted the other officers, and they carefully searched the man once they reached a secure location. What they found removed any doubt about the severity of the situation. Inside the jacket pocket was a detailed map of Windsor Castle, marked with security positions and timing notes. There was also a second phone, this one containing photographs of the castle taken from multiple angles over what appeared to be several days. The man had been conducting detailed surveillance, gathering intelligence about security procedures and royal family movements. The man was immediately placed under formal arrest. His shouted protests about innocence rang hollow against the physical evidence found in his possession. James stood nearby as other officers processed the scene, his adrenaline still elevated from the rapid response. He had acted on instinct and training, and that action had potentially prevented a serious incident. Back at the security command post, senior officers were reviewing footage from multiple cameras that had captured the incident. Response noted the speed of his decision-making, observed the coordination between security team members. The footage showed clearly that James had identified a genuine threat and responded appropriately. His actions would be thoroughly analyzed, but initial assessments indicated he had followed protocols precisely. The crowd outside had been asked to disperse, the public appearance canceled due to the security incident. Disappointed families gathered their belongings and began leaving, many checking their phones for news about what had happened. Rumors were already spreading through social media, but official statements would wait until the investigation progressed further. James was asked to provide an immediate verbal report while details were fresh in his memory. He recounted his observations chronologically, describing the man's suspicious behavior, the surveillance-like activity, the sudden tensing when the royal family appeared, and the movement toward the concealed object. His report was clear, precise, and professional, exactly what was expected from an officer of his experience and training. Other security personnel reported their observations, corroborating James's account. The plainclothes officers who had moved into position near the suspicious man confirmed his unusual behavior and evident surveillance activities. The security camera footage provided additional confirmation, showing the man's movements and positioning over the previous 30 minutes. As the initial response phase concluded, senior officers began coordinating with counterterrorism units and intelligence services. The man's identity would be checked against databases. His phones would be forensically analyzed. His background would be thoroughly investigated. Every aspect of the incident would be examined to understand whether this was an isolated individual or part of a larger threat. James was told he could take a brief break while the investigation continued. He walked to a quiet corner of the security office and sat down, allowing himself a moment to process what had just happened. His hands were steady, his breathing controlled, but he felt the familiar post-incident tension in his shoulders. Years of training helped him manage the psychological aftermath of high-stress situations. But the weight of responsibility never entirely disappeared. He thought about Prince Louis, about the innocent child who had been walking toward potential danger. He thought about the other members of the royal family, about the crowd of families who had simply wanted a pleasant morning watching the royals. All of them had been at risk, and it had been James's job to identify and neutralize that risk. Today, he had succeeded. A colleague brought James a cup of tea, a small gesture of support that was appreciated. They sat together in comfortable silence, two professionals who understood the unique pressures of protection work. There would be debriefings, reports to write, and probably commendations to receive. But in that moment, James simply felt grateful that his instincts had been correct and his response had been effective. Outside, police vehicles arrived to transport the arrested man to a facility where formal questioning would take place. Investigators gathered evidence from the scene, photographing the barrier area, collecting the man's belongings, documenting everything for the case file that was already being assembled. The incident had transformed from active response to criminal investigation, and different procedures now applied. James knew that his role in the incident was far from over. He would be interviewed multiple times, asked to recall details from different perspectives, required to write comprehensive reports. His actions would be reviewed by senior officers, legal advisors, and possibly members of the royal household. This was standard procedure for any incident involving potential threats to protected persons. As afternoon approached, James received word that the royal family had been briefed on the incident. They had expressed gratitude for the professional response of the security team. Prince Louis, too young to fully understand what had happened, had simply asked when they could go back outside to wave at people. The innocence of that question reminded everyone why their work mattered. Protecting that innocence, that normalcy, was at the heart of everything they did. The interrogation room at the Thames Valley Police Headquarters was stark and functional. Gray walls, a metal table, uncomfortable chairs, and recording equipment mounted in corners. The man from Windsor Castle sat across from two detectives, his gray jacket now sealed in an evidence bag. His phones being analyzed in a forensic laboratory. His name was Marcus Webb, aged 42. His initial defiance had given way to sullen silence as the weight of evidence mounted against him. Detective Inspector Sarah Morrison led the questioning. She was a veteran of counterterrorism investigations, experienced in extracting information from individuals who believed they had committed no crime. Marcus insisted repeatedly that he had simply wanted to photograph the royal family, that the map and surveillance photos were for a personal project, that his behavior had been misinterpreted by overzealous security personnel. But the forensic analysis of his phones told a different story. The devices contained hundreds of photographs of Windsor Castle taken over a 3-week period. Images of security personnel at different times of day, showing shift changes and patrol patterns. Photographs of vehicle access points, emergency exits, and blind spots in camera coverage. This was not the work of an enthusiastic royal watcher. This was systematic surveillance conducted by someone with a specific purpose. More concerning were the text messages found on the second phone. Encrypted conversations with two other individuals, discussing timing, positioning, and what appeared to be coordinated planning. The messages never explicitly stated an intention to harm anyone. No. But the context and terminology used suggested something far more serious than innocent photography. Counterterrorism analysts were working to decrypt additional messages and identify the other parties involved. Back at Windsor Castle, James Whitmore sat with senior officers from the Royalty Protection Command, reviewing the incident from multiple angles. Video footage was played repeatedly, each viewing revealing new details. The senior officers praised James's threat recognition and rapid response, noting that his actions had likely prevented a serious security breach. But they also wanted to understand his decision-making process to learn from it, and potentially improve training protocols. James explained his observations methodically. He described how Marcus Webb's body language had differed from the surrounding crowd. While families were animated and excited, Marcus had displayed tension and focused surveillance behavior. His positioning near the barrier had been strategic rather than random, offering optimal access when the royal family approached. The combination of these factors had triggered James's trained instincts. The senior officers were particularly interested. In the moment James decided to physically intervene, that decision carried significant weight, as an incorrect assessment could have resulted in negative publicity and potential legal issues. James explained that the movement of Marcus's hand into his jacket, combined with all previous suspicious behaviors, had crossed the threshold from monitoring to active intervention. Training had taught him to act decisively when that threshold was crossed. Meanwhile, at the forensic laboratory, technical analysts were making disturbing discoveries. The map found in Marcus's pocket was not a standard tourist map, but a detailed security schematic that should not have been publicly available. Someone with inside knowledge had either provided this information, or Marcus had obtained it through illegal means. Either possibility raised serious concerns about security vulnerabilities. The timing notes on the map corresponded precisely with known schedules of royal appearances. Marcus had known exactly when and where the royal family would be appearing. Information that was sometimes released publicly, but often with deliberate vagueness for security reasons. The level of detail in Marcus's planning suggested he had access to more precise information than typical members of the public possessed. Detective Morrison received this information during a break in the interrogation. She returned to the room with renewed focus, presenting Marcus with the evidence of his systematic surveillance. Confronted with photographs of his own photographs with the security schematic, with the encrypted messages, Marcus's demeanor changed. The defiance faded, replaced by calculation. He was assessing his legal position, weighing options. That evening, James returned home to his flat in London, exhausted from hours of debriefing and report writing. His wife, Emma, had seen news coverage of a security incident at Windsor Castle and had been worried until James called to assure her he was safe. Now, over a late dinner, he described the day's events in general terms, omitting classified details but conveying the seriousness of what had occurred. Emma listened with the understanding of someone married to a protection officer. She knew the risks James faced daily, knew that his job required constant vigilance and split-second decisions that could have life-or-death consequences. She was proud of him, but also aware of the psychological toll such work could exact. Tonight, she simply held his hand and reminded him that he had done his job exactly as he should have. The following morning, James arrived at the security office to find the investigation had progressed significantly overnight. Marcus Webb had finally requested a lawyer and stopped answering questions. But the forensic analysis had identified the two individuals he had been texting. Both were under surveillance now, their movements being monitored, their communications being intercepted legally through emergency warrants. One of the individuals was a former castle employee who had been dismissed 2 years earlier for security violations. This person had maintained access to certain information systems longer than they should have. using that access to download security protocols and facility maps. They had sold this information to Marcus for reasons investigators were still determining. The betrayal of trust was profound, and criminal charges were being prepared. The second individual was more concerning. She was connected to an extremist group that had been monitored by intelligence services for several years. The group had made threatening statements about the monarchy, but had not previously demonstrated capability or intent to act on those threats. Marcus Webb's involvement potentially changed that assessment. This was no longer a lone individual with grievances, but a coordinated effort involving multiple people and ideological motivation. James was briefed on these developments and informed that his identification and response to Marcus had likely disrupted a larger operation. If Marcus had succeeded in getting close to Prince Louis, whether to harm him directly or simply to breach security in a way that demonstrated vulnerability, it would have achieved the extremist group's goal of undermining public confidence in the monarchy's security. The royal family was briefed more comprehensively now that the investigation had revealed the scope of the threat. Security protocols were being reviewed and updated. The schedule of public appearances was being reassessed. Additional protection measures were being implemented. The incident had exposed vulnerabilities that needed immediate attention, and resources were being allocated to address them. James was asked to participate in a security review meeting with senior members of the Royal Household and Protection Command. His perspective as the officer who had directly confronted the threat was valued. He sat in a conference room with individuals whose names appeared regularly in news reports, discussing in frank terms how close the incident had come to becoming a tragedy. During the meeting, James learned that Marcus Webb had been observed near Windsor Castle on 3 previous occasions over the past month. Security cameras had captured his image, but without the context of suspicious behavior. He had simply been one of thousands of visitors. The benefit of hindsight revealed the surveillance pattern, but in real time, he had not triggered alerts. This was a lesson about the limitations of technological security systems compared to trained human observation. The head of the Royal Protection Command, stern woman named Commander Elizabeth Thornton, praised James publicly during the meeting. She noted that technology was valuable, but human judgment remained irreplaceable. James's years of experience and training had given him the ability to recognize threat, indicators that cameras and algorithms might miss. His actions represented the best of what protection officers could achieve. After the meeting, Commander Thornton spoke with James privately. She informed him that he would be recommended for a commendation. Recognition of his professional excellence and the specific contribution he had made to royal safety, James accepted this news with characteristic humility, stating that he had simply done his job and that any of his colleagues would have acted similarly. Commander Thornton smiled and replied that while many might have eventually identified the threat, James had done so early enough to prevent any harm. Over the following days, additional arrests were made. The former castle employee who had provided security information was taken into custody and charged with multiple offenses related to breaching official secrets and conspiracy. The woman connected to the extremist group was arrested as well. Her residence searched, her electronic devices seized for forensic analysis. The investigation revealed that the plan had been more sophisticated than initially suspected. Marcus was supposed to create a distraction when the royal family approached the barriers. The specific nature of that distraction remained unclear, as Marcus refused to provide details even after his lawyer advised cooperation might reduce his sentence. But the working theory was that he intended to either break through security or create enough chaos that the woman connected to the extremist group could approach from a different direction. This woman, identified as Rachel Morrison, no relation to the detective investigating the case, had been positioned in a different section of the crowd that morning. She had left the scene when she saw Marcus being detained by security, understanding that their plan had failed. Surveillance footage from that day showed her rapid departure. Her obvious distress, her use of multiple forms of transport to obscure her movements. Professional watchers from intelligence services had tracked her nonetheless. Rachel's residence contained manifestos, propaganda materials, and disturbing sketches depicting violence against royal family members. Her computer held research into security vulnerabilities, studies of past attacks on public figures, and communications with other extremists across Europe. She had been radicalized gradually over several years, her beliefs becoming increasingly dangerous and disconnected from reality. James was troubled when he learned these details. He had stopped Marcus Webb, but Rachel Morrison had been in the crowd as well, potentially armed, potentially prepared to act if Marcus had succeeded in his distraction. The layered nature of the threat meant that even successful intervention against one element might not have prevented tragedy. It reinforced the importance of comprehensive security that addressed multiple simultaneous threats. The trial preparations began quickly, as the prosecutors wanted to demonstrate the system's responsiveness to threats against the royal family. Evidence was overwhelming with surveillance footage. Forensic analysis of electronic devices witnessed testimony from multiple security personnel, and the physical evidence found in Marcus's possession. The defense lawyers faced an almost impossible task. But they would argue that thoughts and planning, however disturbing, were distinct from actual intent to commit violence. James would be a key witness in the trial. He spent hours with prosecutors reviewing his testimony, ensuring his recollections were precisely documented. He would need to describe what he saw, what he thought, and why he acted. The defense would attempt to portray him as overreacting, as seeing threats where none existed, as violating Marcus's rights through aggressive intervention. James and the prosecutors prepared for these arguments, building a case that demonstrated reasonable and necessary action. Meanwhile, policy discussions were occurring at the highest levels of government. The Home Secretary met with representatives of the royal household, intelligence services, and law enforcement to discuss implications of the failed attack. Questions were raised about monitoring of extremist groups, about information security within royal facilities, about the balance between public accessibility and protection of high-profile individuals. These discussions would continue for months, likely resulting in new policies and procedures. But in the immediate aftermath, the focus was on ensuring such an incident could not be repeated. Security around royal family members was intensified. Public appearances were reduced temporarily. Intelligence services increased monitoring of individuals and groups identified as potential threats. For James, life gradually returned to normal patterns, though the incident remained present in his daily awareness. He continued his duties with the same professional attention he had always demonstrated. But colleagues noticed a quiet confidence that had deepened. He had faced a real threat, had trusted his instincts, and had protected those under his care. Every protection officer hoped they would never face such a moment. But if they did, they hoped they would respond as James had. Emma noticed changes as well. James seemed more present at home, more appreciative of ordinary moments. The incident had reminded him of the fragility of safety, of how quickly normalcy could shatter. He was more patient with their children, more deliberate in his conversations with Emma. The experience had recalibrated his understanding of what mattered most in life, reinforcing priorities that the daily routine sometimes obscured. Months would pass before the trial concluded, before all the connected individuals were sentenced, before the full scope of the conspiracy was publicly understood. But already, the incident was being studied in training academies, analyzed in security journals, discussed in professional conferences. James Whitmore's actions had become a case study in effective threat recognition and response, an example of how training, experience, and instinct combined to prevent tragedy. 3 months after the incident at Windsor Castle, the trial of Marcus Webb, Rachel Morrison, and the former Castle employee, David Fletcher, began at the Central Criminal Court in London. The courthouse, known as the Old Bailey, had seen countless trials throughout its long history, but cases involving threats to the royal family always carried special significance. Security was intense, with armed police positioned throughout the building and strict screening procedures for anyone entering the courtroom. James Whitmore arrived early on the morning he was scheduled to testify. He wore his dress uniform, every detail precise and professional. Emma had straightened his tie before he left home, kissed him for luck, and reminded him to speak clearly and confidently. James was not nervous about testifying. He had rehearsed his account dozens of times with prosecutors, and he knew his actions had been correct. But he understood the importance of this testimony to the larger case. The courtroom was filled with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had secured the limited available seats. The judge, a distinguished woman named Justice Caroline Ashford, presided with stern authority. The prosecution team was led by a senior barrister known for handling high-profile national security cases. The defense was represented by 3 separate teams, one for each defendant, each attempting to create distance between their client and the others. When James was called to the witness stand, he walked forward with measured steps, placed his hand on the Bible, and took the oath with clear conviction. The prosecutor began with straightforward questions, establishing James's credentials, his years of experience, his training in threat recognition, and protective procedures. This foundation was necessary to establish him as an expert witness whose observations and decisions carried professional weight. Then the questioning moved to the specific events of that June morning. James described his position at Windsor Castle, his responsibility for monitoring the crowd, his systematic observation of the people gathered along the barriers. He explained how Marcus Webb had caught his attention through behavioral anomalies, through movements and positioning that differed from the excited family surrounding him. The prosecutor displayed photographs taken from security cameras showing Marcus in the crowd at various times. James identified each image, explaining what he had observed and what those observations had suggested. He described Marcus's repeated glances at security positions, his consultation of his phone in ways that suggested coordination with others, his evident tension as the royal family's appearance approached. When asked about the critical moment when he decided to intervene, James's testimony was particularly detailed. He explained the significance of Marcus's hand moving inside his jacket, the potential threat that movement represented, and the training that guided his response. He described vaulting the barrier, securing Marcus's wrist, controlling the situation until additional officers arrived. His account was calm, factual, and professional. The defense cross-examination began with Marcus Webb's barrister, a sharp-featured man named Gerald Hartley, who specialized in civil liberties cases. Hartley attempted to portray James as having overreacted, suggesting that Marcus had simply been reaching for his phone to take a photograph. He questioned whether James's military-style response had been proportionate to the actual threat level. James responded with the same professional calm he had maintained throughout his testimony. He explained that protection officers must respond to indicators of threat, not wait for actual harm to occur. He detailed the specific behaviors that had triggered his assessment, emphasizing that his decision was based on multiple factors rather than a single action. When Hartley pressed about the possibility of innocent explanations, James calmly noted that the evidence found on Marcus supported the threat assessment. Hartley then attempted a different approach, suggesting that James had been influenced by stereotypes or prejudices, that Marcus's appearance or demeanor had triggered unwarranted suspicion. This line of questioning was potentially damaging, as it touched on sensitive issues of profiling and discrimination. But James's response was measured and effective. He explained that his observations were behavior-based rather than appearance-based, focused on actions and patterns rather than physical characteristics. The prosecutor objected to several of Hartley's questions as argumentative or irrelevant, objections that Justice Ashford sustained. The cross-examination continued for nearly 2 hours, but Hartley was unable to significantly undermine James's testimony. The security camera footage corroborated every observation James had described. The physical evidence found on Marcus validated the threat assessment. James's professional reputation and training records supported his credibility. After James completed his testimony and was dismissed, he remained in the courthouse to observe the remainder of the proceedings. Other security personnel testified, describing their observations and responses. The technical analysts presented their forensic findings, explaining the content found on Marcus's phones and the significance of the encrypted communications. The evidence built systematically, creating a comprehensive picture of a coordinated plan to breach royal security. David Fletcher, the former Castle employee who had provided confidential information, testified as part of a plea agreement. His defense team had negotiated a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation with prosecutors. Fletcher described how Marcus had approached him months earlier, claiming to be a security consultant, conducting an authorized review. Fletcher, bitter about his dismissal from Castle employment, had been willing to help, providing maps and schedules he still had access to through security oversights. Fletcher's testimony was damaging to Marcus's defense. It established premeditation, planning, and deliberate acquisition of confidential information. The defense attempted to portray Fletcher as an unreliable witness, seeking leniency through false testimony. But the physical evidence supported his account. The maps found in Marcus's possession matched exactly the documents Fletcher had provided, including specific markings and annotations. Rachel Morrison's involvement was established through testimony from intelligence officers who had been monitoring the extremist group she belonged to. These officers described intercepted communications, surveillance observations, and Rachel's presence at Windsor Castle on the morning of the incident. Her departure immediately after Marcus's detention suggested awareness of the plan and consciousness of guilt. Her lawyers argued this was coincidental, that her departure was simply bad timing that looked suspicious in hindsight. But the evidence found at Rachel's residence undermined this defense. The manifestos and violent sketches, the research into security vulnerabilities, the communications with other extremists, all painted a picture of someone capable of and willing to commit violence against royal family members. Expert witnesses testified about radicalization patterns and how individuals like Rachel progressed from extreme beliefs to potential violent action. The trial continued for 3 weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses, presentation of hundreds of pieces of evidence, and lengthy legal arguments about admissibility and interpretation. James returned to his regular duties during this period, though he followed news coverage of the trial closely. The case had become a national story, discussed in newspapers and television programs, analyzed by security experts and legal commentators. Public reaction was overwhelmingly supportive of the security personnel who had prevented the potential attack. James received messages from members of the public thanking him for his service and praising his quick thinking. Some of this attention was uncomfortable for him, as he preferred to work quietly without public recognition. But he understood that the case had captured public attention because it touched on deep concerns about safety and the vulnerability of beloved public figures. The royal family maintained public silence about the trial, as was traditional during legal proceedings. But privately, members of the royal household conveyed appreciation to James and the security team. Prince William and Princess Catherine sent personal letters, thanking the protection officers for their dedication and professionalism. These letters were not publicized, but they meant a great deal to James and his colleagues. As the trial approached its conclusion, the prosecution delivered closing arguments that methodically laid out the evidence of conspiracy to breach security and potential harm to royal family members. The prosecutor emphasized that the defendants had gone far beyond mere planning, that they had taken concrete steps toward executing their plan, and that only the vigilance and professional action of security personnel had prevented a potentially tragic outcome. The defense closing arguments attempted to create reasonable doubt, suggesting that the defendants' actions, while perhaps ill-advised, did not constitute actual intent to commit violence. They argued that possessing maps and conducting surveillance was not equivalent to planning an attack, that the encrypted communications were being interpreted in the most sinister possible light, and that the prosecution had not proven what the defendants actually intended to do when they gained proximity to the royal family. Justice Ashford provided jury instructions that carefully explained the legal standards for conspiracy and the various charges the defendants faced. She emphasized that the jury must determine whether the evidence proved it's beyond reasonable doubt that the defendants had agreed to commit crimes and had taken substantial steps toward executing those agreements. The jury's responsibility was to weigh the evidence objectively and reach verdicts based on facts rather than emotions. The jury deliberated for 4 days, a length of time that made everyone involved in the case anxious. James tried to focus on his regular duties, but he found himself checking his phone repeatedly for news updates. The waiting was difficult, filled with uncertainty about whether the jury would reach the same conclusions that seemed obvious to those familiar with security work and threat assessment. On a gray Thursday afternoon, word came that the jury had reached verdicts. James was at Windsor Castle when he received the notification. He immediately requested permission to leave his post temporarily, wanting to be present when the verdicts were announced. His supervisor granted the request. Understanding the personal significance of the outcome for James, the courtroom filled quickly as word spread that verdicts were imminent. James found a seat near the back, not wanting to draw attention. The defendants were brought in, each flanked by security officers, their expressions revealing various degrees of tension and resignation. The jury filed in, their faces carefully neutral, giving no indication of their decisions. Justice Ashford asked the jury foreman to stand and deliver the verdicts. The courtroom fell completely silent, every person present leaning forward slightly, anticipating the announcement. The foreman, a middle-aged man with glasses, stood and held a paper with visible trembling in his hands. For Marcus Webb, the charges included conspiracy to breach security, possession of confidential information, and planning to commit acts endangering protected persons. The foreman read each charge and delivered the verdict in a clear voice. Guilty on all counts. Marcus's expression did not change. He had likely known this outcome was inevitable given the overwhelming evidence against him. For Rachel Morrison, the charges were similar but included additional counts related to her extremist activities and communications. Again, the verdicts came back guilty on all counts. Rachel closed her eyes as each guilty verdict was announced, her shoulders sagging slightly with each pronouncement. Whatever ideology had motivated her actions now seemed inadequate. Against the reality of criminal conviction and impending imprisonment, David Fletcher, having testified against the others, faced reduced charges under his plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to unauthorized disclosure of information and had been promised a lighter sentence. His conviction was a formality, but it meant all three defendants would face consequences for their actions. Justice Ashford announced that sentencing would occur the following week, allowing time for preparation of pre-sentence reports and victim impact statements. She remanded all three defendants to custody pending sentencing. As they were led from the courtroom, Marcus glanced around one final time, his eyes passing over the assembled observers without apparent recognition or emotion. Rachel kept her head down, refusing to look at anyone. James left the courthouse feeling a sense of closure. The verdicts validated his actions on that June morning, confirmed that his threat assessment had been accurate, and demonstrated that the justice system had functioned as intended. He called Emma immediately, sharing the news, hearing her relieved response. She had worried about how James would handle the responsibility if the verdicts had been different, if somehow his actions had been deemed inappropriate or excessive. The sentencing hearing the following week brought the case to its conclusion. Justice Ashford delivered lengthy statements explaining her reasoning for each sentence. Marcus Webb received 12 years imprisonment for his role as the primary organizer of the conspiracy. Rachel Morrison received 10 years, with the judge noting her ideological motivations and the danger she represented. David Fletcher received for years, reduced from what might have been longer due to his cooperation with prosecutors. The sentences were reported extensively in the media, generally receiving approval from security experts and the public. Some civil liberties advocates questioned whether the sentences were excessive, given that no actual harm had occurred. But most commentators agreed that the seriousness of threatening the royal family, combined with the detailed planning and coordination involved, warranted substantial punishment. For James, the conclusion of the trial meant he could finally move forward from the incident. It had dominated his life for months, through the initial response, the investigation, trial preparation, and the proceedings themselves. Now, with convictions secured and sentences delivered, the case would fade into legal history while he returned to the daily work of protection that rarely involved. Such dramatic moments, 6 months after the trial concluded, James Whitmore stood in the ballroom of Buckingham Palace, wearing his dress uniform, medals arranged precisely on his chest. The room was filled with recipients of various honors, their families, and members of the royal household. Outside, it was a cold December morning, but inside the palace, warmth and grandeur surrounded the assembled guests. James felt a mixture of pride and humility as he waited for the ceremony to begin. Emma stood nearby with their 2 children, 10-year-old Sophie and 7-year-old Thomas. The children were dressed in their finest clothes, instructed repeatedly about proper behavior during the ceremony. Sophie kept whispering questions about the palace, about the royal family, about what was going to happen. Emma answered patiently while keeping watchful eyes on both children, ensuring they remained well-behaved. The ceremony began with formal announcements. Various individuals were called forward to receive honors for achievements in arts, sciences, public service, and military valor. Each recipient approached the designated position, received their honor from the presenting royal, exchanged brief words, and then moved to join the other honorees. The process was dignified and efficient, refined through centuries of tradition. When James's name was called, he walked forward with measured steps, aware of Emma and the children watching, aware of his colleagues from the Protection Command present in the audience, aware of the significance of this moment. He had been awarded the Royal Victorian Order for his exceptional service protecting the royal family. The honor was personally bestowed by members of the royal family, recognizing individuals who had served them directly. Prince William stood as the presenting royal that day. James approached, came to attention, and bowed precisely as protocol required. The prince held the medal and spoke quietly, words meant for James alone, despite the audience present. He thanked James personally for his vigilance and quick action that June morning at Windsor. He mentioned Prince Louis specifically, expressing gratitude that his son had been protected from potential harm. The prince pinned the medal to James's uniform with care. They shook hands and the prince smiled warmly, a gesture of genuine appreciation rather than mere ceremony. James felt the weight of that smile, understanding that behind the public roles and protocols, there was real gratitude from a father whose child had been in danger. That human connection made the honor more meaningful than any medal could be on its own. After the ceremony concluded, there was a reception where honorees could mingle with royal family members and other guests. James found himself in conversation with Commander Elizabeth Thornton, who had also attended the ceremony. She congratulated him again, noting that his award reflected well on the entire Protection Command. His actions had demonstrated the effectiveness of their training programs and the caliber of personnel serving in royal protection. Other colleagues approached to offer congratulations, some teasing James good-naturedly about becoming famous. James deflected the attention with characteristic modesty, insisting that any of them would have acted similarly in his position. But his colleagues knew better. They understood that while many might have eventually identified the threat Marcus Webb posed, James had done so early and decisively, preventing what could have been a catastrophic security failure. Emma and the children joined James once the formal reception concluded. Sophie was bursting with excitement, having seen several members of the royal family at close proximity. Thomas was more interested in the palace itself, asking questions about how many rooms it contained and whether there were secret passages. James smiled at their innocent enthusiasm, grateful they could experience this moment without understanding the darkness that had necessitated it. As they left the palace and walked through the winter afternoon toward their car, James reflected on the journey that had led to this moment. From the routine morning assignment at Windsor Castle to the split-second decision to intervene, from the hours of interrogation and investigation to the trial and convictions, and now to this recognition of his service. The path had been unexpected and challenging, but walking it had reinforced his commitment to the work he had chosen. Life returned to its normal patterns over the following months. James continued his duties with the Protection Command, rotating through various assignments protecting different members of the royal family. Some days were spent at Windsor Castle, others at Kensington Palace, or accompanying royals to public engagements across the country. The work was demanding but rewarding, combining careful planning with constant vigilance. The security protocols had been updated following comprehensive reviews prompted by the June incident. New procedures were implemented for managing crowds during public appearances. Enhanced surveillance systems were installed at royal residences. Intelligence sharing between protection units and counterterrorism agencies was improved. The lessons learned from Marcus Webb's conspiracy were being applied systematically to prevent future threats. James participated in several training sessions, where the incident was used as a case study. He found it somewhat uncomfortable to have his actions analyzed and discussed by colleagues and trainees, but he understood the educational value. The sessions focused on threat recognition, decision-making under pressure, and coordination between security personnel during active response situations. Instructors emphasized that James's success had resulted from applying training principles rather than improvisation. One afternoon in spring, James received an unexpected message. Marcus Webb had requested to meet with him. The request came through official channels, with prison officials and legal advisors involved in the communication. Marcus, now serving his sentence in a high-security facility, had apparently spent considerable time reflecting on the events that had led to his incarceration. He wanted to speak with the man who had stopped him. James discussed the request with Emma and with his supervisors. There was no obligation to accept such a meeting, and some advised against it. But James felt curious about Marcus's motivations, about what had driven him to plan an action that could have ended tragically. After careful consideration, he agreed to the meeting, which was arranged for a few weeks later at the prison where Marcus was housed. The prison was a stark contrast to the palace where James had received his award months earlier. Gray concrete walls, multiple security checkpoints, guards watching every movement. James was escorted to a meeting room where Marcus sat at a metal table, wearing prison clothing, looking older than his years. The defiance James remembered from the day of the arrest was gone, replaced by something more complicated. Regret, perhaps, or resignation. They spoke for nearly an hour. A conversation that was monitored, but private in its content. Marcus explained that he had been radicalized gradually through online communities, through carefully constructed arguments that had made attacking the monarchy seem justified and necessary. He described the planning process, the recruitment of David Fletcher, the coordination with Rachel Morrison. He acknowledged that his actions had been wrong, that he had allowed ideology to override basic humanity. Marcus asked James what he had seen that morning. What had triggered the intervention? James described his observations, the behavioral indicators that had suggested threat rather than innocent interest. Marcus listened carefully, nodding occasionally, understanding how his own actions had betrayed his intentions. He admitted that he had been nervous, that his tension had been visible to anyone trained to recognize such signs. Toward the end of their conversation, Marcus asked about Prince Louis. Was the child aware of what had almost happened? James responded that the prince had been very young during the incident. He had been protected from understanding the danger. Marcus seemed relieved by this, as though knowing the child had not been traumatized provided some small measure of redemption. He apologized to James, not for his own capture, but for placing James in a position where he had to act, where he carried the weight of what might have happened. James left the prison with mixed feelings. He did not forgive Marcus for planning harm against a child, against any member of the royal family. But he had seen a human being struggling with the consequences of his choices, wrestling with guilt and the reality of a long imprisonment ahead. The meeting provided closure of a different kind, a recognition that even those who commit serious wrongs are complex individuals shaped by circumstance and choice. Back home that evening, Emma asked about the meeting. James described it briefly, conveying Marcus's apparent remorse without excusing his actions. Emma listened thoughtfully, then reminded James that his job was not to judge or forgive. His job was to protect, and he had done that job exceptionally well. Whatever complicated humanity existed within Marcus, Webb did not change the fact that James had prevented potential tragedy. Years passed. The incident at Windsor Castle gradually faded from public consciousness, replaced by newer stories and concerns. James continued his work, eventually promoted to a senior position within the Protection Command. He trained newer officers, passing on the lessons he had learned, emphasizing the importance of vigilance and trusting professional instincts. Sophie and Thomas grew older, eventually understanding more fully what their father did and what had happened that June morning when they were younger. Sophie, now studying criminal justice at university, sometimes asked her father about the incident, seeking to understand the psychology of threat assessment and protection work. Thomas, more interested in technology, wondered about the security systems and surveillance capabilities that supported human officers. On the 10th anniversary of the incident, a small ceremony was held at Windsor Castle. James attended along with other officers who had been present that day. Commander Thornton, now retired, gave brief remarks about the importance of the work protection officers did, about the reality that their success was often measured in tragedies prevented rather than dramatic interventions. She noted that most days were routine, but readiness for the exceptional days was what defined professional excellence. After the ceremony, James walked alone to the spot where he had vaulted the barrier a decade earlier. The location looked unchanged, still the same carefully maintained grounds, the same proximity to where crowds gathered during public appearances. But standing there, James saw it differently. He saw the years of training that had prepared him for that moment. He saw the split seconds of decision-making that had determined an outcome. He saw the responsibility that came with protecting those who could not protect themselves. Prince Louis, now a teenager, had no memory of that morning. He lived his life with the freedom and normalcy that security professionals worked constantly to preserve. He attended school, played sports, pursued interests, all without awareness of the countless hours of planning and vigilance that made that normalcy possible. In many ways, this was the greatest success of protection work. The threats stopped, the dangers prevented, allowing innocent lives to continue untroubled. James eventually retired from the protection command after 25 years of service. His career had included that one dramatic intervention, but countless more days of quiet vigilance. He had protected royal family members during hundreds of public appearances, traveled with them to dozens of countries, stood ready during ceremonies, meetings, and private moments. His service had been marked by absolute discretion, unwavering professionalism, and the kind of dedication that defined the best protection officers at his retirement ceremony. Surrounded by colleagues and family, James reflected on what the work had meant. It was not about the medals or recognition, though those had their place. It was about the knowledge that he had served something larger than himself, protected people who mattered to the nation, had stood between innocence and harm. The incident with Marcus Webb had been the most visible moment of his career, but it was representative of the constant readiness that characterized everyday Emma. Now gray-haired but still the steady presence she had always been, stood beside James during his retirement. She had lived with the reality of his work for decades, with the irregular hours, the security concerns, the psychological weight he sometimes carried. She had supported him through training, through deployments, through the stress of high-profile assignments. Her contribution to his success was immeasurable, though it would never be officially recognized. In his retirement speech, James thanked his colleagues, his family, and the royal family for the privilege of serving. He spoke about the incident at Windsor Castle, not as a moment of personal heroism, but as an example of what could be achieved when training, experience, and instinct aligned. He emphasized that protection work required teams, not individuals, and that his success had depended on the immediate response of other officers that morning and throughout the investigation that followed. Years later. When journalists occasionally contacted James for interviews about the incident, he generally declined. The story had been told, the lessons learned, the legal proceedings concluded. He had no interest in rehashing details for public entertainment. But occasionally, when approached by serious researchers or security professionals seeking to understand the case for educational purposes, he would agree to brief conversations. In these conversations, James emphasized several key points. First, that threat recognition required constant practice and attention to detail. Second, that decisions in critical moments must be based on training rather than emotion. Third, that security work was fundamentally about prevention rather than reaction. And fourth, that the human cost of failure in protection work was too high to accept anything less than absolute dedication. The incident had changed James's life in ways both visible and subtle. The award, the recognition, the professional advancement were all outcomes of that June morning. But more significantly, it had deepened his understanding of his own capabilities and limitations. He had faced a moment of extreme responsibility and had responded effectively. That knowledge stayed with him, informing his approach to challenges both professional and personal. Marcus Webb remained in prison, his earliest possible release date still years away. He had participated in various rehabilitation programs, attempting to undo the radicalization that had led to his crimes. Whether he would eventually be released and what kind of life he might build afterward remained uncertain. The justice system had determined his punishment, and he was serving it with apparent acceptance of his responsibility. Rachel Morrison had been released on parole after serving 8 years of her sentence. She lived quietly in a small town, subject to monitoring by law enforcement. Forbidden from participating in extremist activities, she worked in a charity shop, kept to herself, and by all accounts, had rejected the ideology that had once consumed her. Whether her transformation was genuine or strategic, whether she truly understood the harm she had planned, were questions without definitive answers. David Fletcher had been released after serving his full 4-year sentence. He had not been able to find security work again, unsurprisingly given his criminal record. He worked in warehouse logistics, a quiet life far from the castle where he had once been employed. He had issued public apologies for his actions, expressing shame about his betrayal of trust. These apologies were noted but changed nothing about the consequences he continued to face. For Prince Louis, life continued with the unique combination of privilege and scrutiny that defined royal existence. He attended school, participated in official duties appropriate to his age, and gradually learned about the responsibilities that came with his position. Whether he had ever been told the specific details of that June morning was unclear. Perhaps it was better that he did not carry the knowledge of how close danger had come. James's legacy within the Protection Command extended beyond the single incident. He had demonstrated principles that became part of the organization's culture. Trust your training. Recognize patterns. Act decisively when necessary. Support your colleagues. Maintain professionalism under all circumstances. These principles were not revolutionary, but James's career embodied them so completely that he became a standard against which others measured themselves. In his retirement, James occasionally visited training facilities where new protection officers learned their craft. He did not seek these opportunities, but when invited, he attended willingly. He would watch exercises, observe scenario training, and occasionally offer thoughts when asked. The trainees knew his history, knew about Windsor Castle, and his presence served as a connection between training and reality. One afternoon, a young officer asked James if he had been afraid that morning when he vaulted the barrier and confronted Marcus Webb. James considered the question carefully before answering. He explained that fear existed but was managed through training. The body responded with adrenaline, the mind processed threats and options, and the training took over. Fear did not disappear, but it was channeled into focused action rather than paralysis. Another trainee asked what James would have done if Marcus had been armed with an actual weapon rather than a phone. James explained that the response would have been different, more aggressive, potentially including use of force, but the initial assessment and intervention would have been the same. The goal was always to control the threat as early as possible before it could escalate to violence. These conversations revealed something important about James's approach. He did not view himself as uniquely capable or heroic. He understood himself as a trained professional who had faced a challenging situation and had responded according to his preparation. He believed any well-trained officer would have acted similarly, and that belief was both humble and empowering. It suggested that excellence in protection work was achievable through dedication rather than innate talent. As James moved deeper into retirement, he found satisfaction in quiet pursuits: gardening, reading, spending time with Emma and their growing family as Sophie and Thomas brought partners and eventually children into their lives. The intensity of protection work faded, replaced by the gentle rhythms of domestic life. But the core of who he was remained shaped by those years of service, by the responsibility he had carried, and by the knowledge that he had protected those who needed protection. The incident at Windsor Castle became a moment frozen in time, studied by security professionals, discussed in training programs, analyzed in academic papers about protection methodologies. But for James, it was simply part of a larger story about choosing to serve, about dedicating a career to work that often went unnoticed but was always essential. The heroic takedown that had saved the day was real. But it was also just one morning in a career of mornings where vigilance prevented harm. Standing in his garden on a summer evening years after his retirement, James sometimes thought about that day. About Marcus Webb's tension, about Rachel Morrison in the crowd, about Prince Louis walking innocently toward potential danger. He thought about the split-second decisions, the training that had guided him, the colleagues who had supported the response, and he felt grateful that he had been in the right place, with the right preparation, able to act when action was necessary. That, ultimately, was what service meant. Being ready when readiness mattered most.